What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel and welcome back to another video. As you can tell, we got the JK in the shop as well as a fresh set of Balljoint Deletes from American Iron Off-Road. So in this video, before we start the install, we're gonna take a look at your typical ball joint and then talk about Balljoint Deletes. What exactly are they doing? What's the differences? Why are we deleting them? And what are we gonna gain from a set of Balljoint Deletes on our Jeep? I've had a ton of people reach out and ask me, hey, can you make this video, go through it? A lot of people don't really understand what exactly Balljoint Deletes are and why you might want them. So before we start the install, I do want to say it is 97 degrees in the shop, so please bear with me in this video. We have our work cut out for us, but I know a lot of you guys are gonna benefit from this video, and this is just one more thing that we can add to our Jeep to make it a little more bomb-proof. Let's go ahead and take an up-close look at a Balljoint Delete and talk about what the differences are and why you want these under your Jeep. Before we dive in too deep on the Balljoint Deletes, it's important that we take a step back and understand ball joints themselves. Now, if you're a Jeep owner, you're probably aware that the ball joints are a kind of a wear item, especially once we add larger tires and start taking our Jeep through rough terrain. The ball joints, especially the factory ones, just don't last. Now, there are a ton of different aftermarket ball joints that are stronger, rebuildable, but in the end, the design of a ball joint just is not that smart. So prior to the ball joint, there's a thing called a kingpin, which pretty much utilized a cup and cone design and a bearing on it to allow our axle to move left and right for steering. Now, when they implemented ball joints, probably because of cost, and honestly, these are a little bit easier to, change out than a kingpin, there's really no need for a ball and socket design. Now, this is just a random ball joint that I have just for visual representation, but as you can tell, I kind of bent it there. Now, the ball joint, all it really needs to do is twist left and right. There's no need for this extra access up here. Axis, just like a tie rod end. We have the up and down play, but we can also spin it left and right. It's very similar comparing a tie rod end like this to kind of a Heim joint style. And that's where the Balljoint Deletes come into play. These use a spherical rod bearing design instead of your typical ball and socket design. Now, we are gonna dive in and take an up close look at these in a little bit, but I think once we're actually installing it on the Jeep, you'll be able to see a little more on what I'm talking about. But back to the ball joints, when these fail or start going bad, that little ball and socket is gonna have a little bit of play from rotating and that heavy weight, the metal on metal design. Some use a little plastic liner up top and that gets play. What is gonna happen is your wheel is gonna move up and down in relation to the axle. So your axle is gonna stay still and that ball joint's gonna start having a little bit of play, making your Jeep drive bad, and you'll get some tire wear. Now, on the flip side of that, there can be some catastrophic failure with ball joints. The ball joint itself, the ball can separate out of this ball joint completely, which leads to a horrible failure. Now, I'll throw some pictures below, and what happens is when these break off, your knuckle pretty much comes off the Jeep, meaning you are going to be doing a new ball joint job on the trail, which is not gonna be fun and lead to a very, very long day. And hopefully, your knuckle can be saved, because usually when these ball joints break, they usually split apart your knuckle. And on top of that, there's one more really bad thing about ball joints themselves. Every time we're replacing ball joints, we have to press this up into the axle housing. What's gonna happen eventually after the third, fourth, fifth time of replacing ball joints, it's gonna start getting a little bit loose because they are a press fit. Then you're gonna have to move towards a knurled ball joint, which fits up there a little bit more snug. But then once you go with that, eventually your axle is gonna be trashed. You can't keep replacing press-in ball joints all the time. Now, there are other ball joints on the market that are rebuildable, but we still have a lot of those cons of a ball joint. So American Iron Off-Road decided to come out with a set of Balljoint Deletes. So what that means is we're pretty much moving away from the ball joint style and installing more of a hybrid kingpin, spherical bearing style ball joint, if you will. Now, they make these for the XJ, TJ, JK, JT, JL, and of course some of the Danish 60 models for those of you that have done a swap. But what these are, they're completely rebuildable, made here in the USA. The list goes on, a lot of pros about these. But swapping to that spherical bearing design is gonna bring us back to kind of a kingpin style. And in a way, once we start installing these on the Jeep, you'll see that there's no way for this to separate or fall apart unless you literally break the bolt in half, which I've never heard of happening on a set of Balljoint Deletes. Now, I do have one kind of disassembled here on the table, but I think the best way to explain what all goes into this and how to do it is once we're actually under the Jeep. So first things first, we have to lift the Jeep up, pull everything off, and get ready just like we would with any other ball joint replacement jobs. And just like that, the driver's side knuckle is removed and ready. Well, not yet. So the next step is to go ahead and remove the ball joints from the knuckle. Now on a Dana 60, the ball joints are pressed in on the knuckle opposed to the axle C, which is pretty nice. However, we want to get rid of ball joints completely. So what a lot of people do when they go ahead and start looking at their ball joints is they'll wiggle it like this, like, man, those ball joints are shot. Like I mentioned, since it is a ball and socket, kind of like a tie rod, you know, ball joint style, that side-to-side movement is normal. What we don't want to see is any in and out movement. So hopefully the GoPro can pick it up, but we have some in and out movement on our upper ball joint. The lower, you can't see it on the camera, but I can find it doesn't feel right. There's a little bit of clicking. Either way, I want to ditch these ball joints completely. American Iron Off-Road sells these in 2 different styles for the Dana 60. One being the weld-in kit, which is extremely strong, probably the strongest setup you can go, and their new kit, which I'm installing, which is the press-in kit. It's a little more user-friendly, especially for those guys that don't want to weld. Welding onto the cast iron or the cast steel knuckle sometimes can be a little bit hard, and with the press-in kit, we're still going to get a ton of like extra strength compared to the ball joints, and we can still weld it if we feel needed. Cuts down on labor if you're having a shop do it, and if you are a DIYer, it's something you could easily do in your garage. But with that being said, the next step is to grab our C-clamp, pop out these ball joints. However, this knuckle has seen better days. You know, I did the Barnes high steer weld-on kit. Living down in South Padre Island for a while, the salt has gotten to it. So we are going to sandblast these knuckles. I'm gonna take them into town. Mike said he has a lead on a sandblasting cabinet, so I'm gonna go reach out to him, hit him up, and see if we can get a sandblasting cabinet, because it would be awesome to have that outside the shop so we can sandblast our own stuff. Either way, I will see you guys later tonight, because it is 112 up here in the shop. I'm a little bit hot. I'm like 80% sweat right now, so I will see you guys later. I'm gonna cool off, probably take a shower before we hop back up here and keep working on the ball joint deletes. We are back with a much more manageable temperature in the shop. It's 89 in here. I actually took a few days, a little break from this project, let the heat die down. Went out to Crossbar, cut a new trail, took the JT down it. That video is gonna be uploaded next week. However, as you can also tell, the knuckles are cleaned up and painted. So one thing I would like to recommend is before you pop out your old ball joints, whether you're sandblasting it or painting it, do it with those old ball joints in, because we don't wanna press them out and then mess up this machined surface of our knuckle. With that being said, we are ready to go to pop out these ball joints and proceed with the ball joint deletes. So now finally, I think we can show you guys the construction of the ball joint deletes and how they're different than your standard ball joint. So here we have the factory, you know, lower ball joint. Here's the factory upper. On the Dana 60, we do have this little camber caster bushing, and we have that as well on the ball joint deletes. But this is the cup that's gonna get pressed in, and this is the spherical FK bearing. These are great top tier, like name brand bearings. This cup is gonna get pressed in. Of course, all of this is gonna be pressed in as assembly, but I just wanna show you guys how it kind of assembles. So we're gonna press our bearing into the cup. There's gonna be a snap ring that holds it in place. So then we have our washer and O-ring. I'm gonna throw our O-ring in there. We have our tapered cone, which is kind of mimicking the ball joint construction here. And then finally, we have our through bolt and our nut. So once we tighten this down in the knuckle, there's no way for that bearing to move up and down at all. You know, first we have the snap ring to hold it in place, but we're also gonna have the bolt tightness, that torque, squeezing it together, keeping it all intact, while still allowing us to have that side-to-side movement that we need to turn our wheels. So as you can tell, extremely easy construction, very easy to rebuild. If you need to replace that bearing, we would just pop this off, take our snap ring out. Now they do offer a 2-year, I think 30,000 mile warranty, and of course the upper ball joint, the construction inside this cup is the same bearing and very similar construction, and we'll talk about this. This is specific for the Dana 60 models here in a little bit, but it is time to go ahead and throw this one in the freezer, actually throw both of these in the freezer, grab the set from the freezer, and start putting it in this knuckle over here. And just like that, the upper is all the way pressed in, and it is time to move to the lower. Now, it is a little bit difficult trying to make sure it goes in all the way straight. I had to set it up a few times to make sure it was pressing in straight, but once we got it lined up, as you can tell, she went in there pretty easy. Now, if we did want to weld it, at this point, we could just do a few tack welds around here, but I don't think it's gonna be necessary. So let's move over to the lower. All 4 ball joint deletes press in extremely easy, not easy, but nice and smoothly into the knuckles. And now we're gonna take a look at this eccentric bushing for the Dana 60 model. So for those of you with, non-Dana 60s, this is not going to apply, but anybody that's done a 1-ton swap, this is an extremely cool part. So this is an eccentric, kind of like a split taper bushing, and as you can tell, it is eccentric. So the more you turn it, it's actually gonna change the degrees. And what that is right here on the chart, this part of the instructions, we can actually change our camber or caster with this. Now, for most people, you're not gonna wanna mess with your camber. What that is if you add negative camber, it's actually gonna tilt the tire in a little bit. Kind of like, you look at those cars like, oh, it's a stance car with all the camber. Now, for the majority of Jeep owners, street-driven rigs, you are not gonna wanna mess with camber unless you have a bent axle. You can kind of dial that back in with these bushings right here. But what we are gonna wanna do is add a little bit of extra caster, which is awesome. That's how your axle tilts back, makes your Jeep drive nice and straight, that return to center feel. And this is gonna give us an extra 1.5 degrees of caster. So they sell these kits in a 3 degree or 1.5. And on the chart here with the instructions, it actually tells us what we need to do. So starting off on a Dana 60, 05 and up, this split end is going to face in towards the axle. On the 04 and up models, or 04 and down, you would actually start with the taper facing out. But in our case, we're gonna start with it in. So in my case, we don't want any camber. Camber would be good if we're racing the Jeep. It would help reduce some of that scrub radius, but on the street, we get a ton of bad tire wear. So we're gonna go 0 degrees camber, which is actually gonna give us 1.5 degrees of caster without affecting our pinion angle at all, which is awesome. So what we have to do is rotate this bushing 90 degrees, and on the driver's side, we're gonna rotate it clockwise. So what we're gonna do is come over here, and I'm gonna do this off camera to make sure it's in exactly 90 degrees, but we're gonna rotate it clockwise, 90 degrees, and we are going to shave this back edge. We're going to mark it and shave it with a flap wheel. That way this thing can sit flush up against this little straight edge right there. So I went ahead and grinded that all the way down. Just do a little bit at a time. Make sure you're nice and flush, and then once it's good to go, you'll put it in there. There won't be much movement. You just don't want to grind away too much to where that bushing can move back and forth. But with that done, it is time to go ahead and grab one of the knuckles and just start putting everything back together. And we have our torque specs on the instructions. Oh, this is gonna be the fun part. The lower bolt is torqued to 100 foot-pounds, the upper is torqued to 80 foot-pounds. We're gonna alternate between the two while we're tightening it up, and we're also gonna make sure we can move our knuckle or ball joints back and forth in between those torque sequences. So everything is buttoned up. At first, it is gonna be nice and tight. It's gonna be a little hard to turn this, but it's gonna break in with time. So next, we're gonna go ahead and mark those nuts with some torque seal, some paint, whatever you want, just so we can visually inspect and make sure those nuts aren't coming loose. Now, to actually tighten these Allen head bolts, this is a 19 millimeter, so make sure you have one of those handy with you. And finally, for those of you that have a Dana 60, and if you have swapped over to the bigger 1550 shafts, this is the stock Dana 60 shaft. It's a common upgrade for these 1-ton swaps, and they're pretty cheap. But what we are gonna have to do is trim this a little, like a 1/4 inch off the bolt on the upper ball joint delete. So I'm gonna grab a Sawzall. You can use a cutoff wheel, whatever you want. We're just gonna move that out of the way, make a nice clean cut, mark those, and then start the reassembly process. And then also do the same thing over on the passenger side. But I will say, like, installing these so far it hasn't been any harder than doing ball joints. And luckily, I think this is gonna be the last time we're ever gonna have to mess with ball joints or like this job on the Jeep. Again, I've never heard of anybody breaking these. They do sell rebuild kits where you could rebuild the bearing if needed. But once again, a lot of people have been running these for 5-6 years and never had to touch them since. Now on the upper, since it does have that split taper design, if we do start getting a little bit of play, all we have to do is come and torque this upper one. So that is enough talking. I'm gonna cut this, get this side put back on, hop on that side, because I am excited to see how these things feel on the road. They're gonna be extremely tight. So I mean, I did have some wear in my old ball joints, and I'm excited to see how much of a difference not only the extra caster is gonna add, but also the fresh, tight set of Balljoint Deletes. So let's finish this job up. Everything is put back together, everything is torqued down, I think, which means the only thing left to do is take it for a road test and see how it handles. We'll put some miles on it, see how it feels, and then come back up in the shop, wrap this video up, and I'm assuming a lot of you guys are probably gonna wanna see a like a long-term review, so here in a few months, we'll do a long-term review on these, and hopefully we'll get Cassie's Jeep in here because she does have JK axles, and do a set of these on the JK axles for all of you JK peeps that wanna see how to do it exactly on a JK. But that's enough talking, let's go hit the road. Make sure there's no funky noises when we turn. Should be good to go. So right off the bat, the Jeep does feel more solid. The steering right now, it does hang a little bit, like it kind of wants to wander a little bit. It's very, very touchy on the steering wheel. Like if you make, my Jeep has never been this solid, I guess I would say. Normally there's a lot of play in the steering wheel, but if I turn, it really wants to follow. So I think the Balljoint Deletes are gonna have to break in a little bit because right now it is very touchy. But that's kind of the exact opposite of what a lot of people feel in their Jeep, is it'll feel extremely loose, kind of wandering, where in this case, if you turn the wheel like a millimeter to the left, it feels like it's going left for sure. Granted, I've only had about 2 miles on it so far, but there's a noticeable difference on how this thing drives. Wow, I really do need an alignment, man. These things feel great on the highway running at 70 right now, but I think we have stiffened up the front end so much that I can really tell that my Jeep is out of alignment. It feels like I definitely have a toe issue, just kind of the way it's floating a little bit, whereas before with the worn ball joints, it was kind of masking that. So I will say these things really do stiffen up the ride of your Jeep. Just got back from the road trip and it is insane how tight the steering feels. Now I was mentioning that I felt like I had a little bit of alignment issues, but we'll get to that in a minute. First thing I noticed is that the steering was incredibly tight. Not as in like turning the wheel tight, but once you were going, any movement on the steering wheel, it was just directly feedback to the tires. It just drove almost not like a Jeep. It's kind of crazy in a good way, Now, if you do have any questions on if if you're thinking about running this kit or doing a Balljoint Delete on your Jeep, head over to the Balljoint Delete Facebook group. I'll put that info in the video description. That way, if you have any questions, specific questions, the owner, Josh from American Iron Off-Road, can answer you, or somebody who's been running this kit on their Jeep for a while. Now, I think the best way to kind of wrap up this whole video is honestly to do another video in a few hundred, maybe 1,000 miles, so we can actually see these things broke in and get some real feedback from them. But I was mentioning on the road that the steering felt great, but it felt like my alignment was off. So I came back here in the shop literally about 2 minutes ago, and I was just looking over the Balljoint Deletes, making sure everything was still torqued down, everything looked good. And I noticed, I came over here and I just started wiggling, and I noticed that, hopefully the GoPro can pick that up. That is not good. I have a blown joint on one of my lower 3 links on the frame side. So I'm gonna have to change that out. That was more than likely that weird floating feeling I was getting every time we were going over a crown of the road, or honestly just driving straight from the torque was putting my axle out of thrust, giving me some really weird steering stuff. But other than that, the Balljoint Deletes themselves, they weren't squeaking, they weren't like creaking, there was nothing ill about those. It was just that like weird floating feel that I especially felt on the highway. So that right here is definitely contributing to our issues. Now, to wrap all of this up, if you're looking to do a ball joint upgrade, I would honestly suggest checking out the Balljoint Deletes because it's almost a one and done job. Once you install these, yes, they could possibly break, you could possibly wear through them, but compared to your typical ball joint, I think these are gonna last, I don't wanna make up a number, but I would say these would last like 5 times longer. Ball joints for us Jeep owners are a crazy thing because we're always going through them, we're breaking them. You can go with the best brand and somehow they still develop wear. And I'm excited to see how these kind of last in the long haul. So like I mentioned earlier, we might do a set on Cassie's Jeep for you JK owners to see exactly what goes into it on a JK axle. But for the most part, the design is the same. You can go with the weld-in system for the Dana 60s, but hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. I don't want to drag this out too much longer. Great product. So far they drive great. There's some other things I need to take care of and we will revisit it here in a few hundred miles. So thanks for watching. Like always, give the video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel. I am heading out down to Texas for another 2 weeks of ADT and I'll be back. We got some great stuff coming your way. I'll see you guys later. That's a lot of movement, man. Oh, let's take a look and see. Wonder how long that's been bad for. Yep, I'm wondering if my exhaust right there just got too hot next to the Enduro. That happens.